Well, welcome. We'll start shortly. As ever, this takes a little bit of time for everyone to join Zoom webinar, so we will get things going very shortly, but welcome. Nice to see so many people joining. Great. Okay, well, I think we'll get cracking. There's a few more will join us, no doubt, as we go. Welcome to this Innovation Forum webinar. I'm Ian Welsh, and I'll be your host for the next 45 minutes or so. We may run to the hour, depending how we're going, but we're certainly for the next 45 minutes. And today, we're going to be discussing the results from Innovation Forum's Sustainable Supply Chain Trend Survey, which we sent out to all our newsletter subscribers a few weeks ago. And many thanks to all of you that took part. We tried to design it so that it would only take a few minutes to complete while producing some interesting results. And joining me to consider these results, I'm delighted to say we have Dr. Emily Goetsch, who's Head of Research UK at Acre, and Dr. Simon Lord, a supply chain expert, formerly a senior executive in the palm oil sector. Welcome to you both. I feel quite, I'm obviously short of a PhD, so I'm delighted to be able to get two PhDs on the line and joining us today. We'll run through the results very shortly. Please do use the Q&A function for all your points, comments and questions. I'll bring them into our conversation. We do want to hear from everybody, so please do be thinking as we go through the results and as you hear from the analysis of our panelists, thinking about any points and comments that you'd like to make, put them in the use of the Q&A function for that. But we'd also like to offer everyone the chance to make their comments or to pose a question live in person. So if you'd like to do this, please use the raise hand function on Zoom, and we will enable your audio and bring you in. Something new for us at Innovation Forum, but we're hoping this is something that will be popular on our webinars. Please do keep any intervention short and to the point, and we do reserve the right to enforce this. Okay, let's go back to the survey results. You should have all received the slide deck, but we'll pull these up now as we run through them. I will bring in Emily and Simon for your specific thoughts a little later, but do please both jump in as we run through the deck if there's anything that you think we should highlight as we go. All right, our first slide. So we asked if there's a shortage of next generation talent in sustainable supply chains, and clearly our survey suggested that there is a bit of a shortage. We'll come into that specifically a bit later on. Next slide. And we asked how we would solve the problem if there's a lack of talent. Training and education clearly came out top. Other interesting points, perhaps looking at attracting diverse and underrepresented talents, that was interesting to see. Some think there's no talent shortage at all. Next slide. And then again, how our companies were addressing the lack of talent. Again, training and education came out top. As I say, I will ask Emily to comment specifically on the talent and recruitment results shortly. Okay, we then asked, next slide, we had, to the extent that the organization is driving innovation and sustainability via procurement. Again, trend towards the positive side of that. I think we can definitely see that here. And then we asked what these innovations are. Now, the thing that jumped out for me here is great to see collaboration there, responsible sourcing there, that's excellent. But something that did jump out was this very few people mentioned certification. If we'd had this survey 10 years ago, I think that certification would have come out significantly higher. So that was something that I certainly was intrigued to see. We then asked about barriers to innovation that they need to overcome. Interesting to see lack of demand. That was a surprise to me. The staffing element comes out again, high cost, not a real surprise to see there. And collaboration, a theme across our results was the collaboration was important. Certainly see that across the different results. So we asked then, what should working groups and industry bodies do to improve? And I thought it was really interesting here to see that certainly the biggest answer by far was being clear on measurement and success. Companies looking for guidance as to what success looks like and how to measure it. So that's really interesting. Next, we asked to name some of the most constructive working groups and industry bodies. That's who were named. Lots of the names you expect to see were there. And then we looked at, which compare really NGOs and business, how our audience thought that their awareness raising and campaigning awareness raising NGOs and businesses were dominated by Western-centric thinking. And if we compare this slide with the next one, there was a definite, as far as I can see, again, unscientific perhaps, definitely that our audience thinks that business is still too dominated by Western-centric thinking more than NGOs. Perhaps not unsurprising, but it's interesting to see that result coming through. Then we, obviously EU-regulation has been a big topic of comment in recent months. We asked if EU regulation is running the risk of encouraging individual business action over collaborative action. Interesting, the survey said 7% said no, which is good, so that it's not running the risk of doing that. And then we did ask, if yes, what they would suggest do to change it. In fact, can we go back to question 5A, please? Go back up a slide. Okay, fine, thank you. Yeah, back to 5B. I thought I'd missed the slide there. But back to 5B then. How to change the risk? Again, stronger regulation implementation. So really implementing the regulation that we have. Don't need more regulation, we need to just implement better. That was certainly what I took from that. Then we asked optimism around technology's potential to solve supply chain problems at scale. Again, our respondents were relatively optimistic, which is nice to see. Then we asked about risks. And this one here, I was surprised to see that climate change is not the dominant risk. I expected climate change to be the biggest risk there. Economic climate, something that of course has been front and center more recently perhaps, but I'd expected to see climate change more dominant there. We'll come back to the risks a little bit later on. And then in terms of opportunities, it was nice to see collaboration out there, and also use of data and technology. That's not perhaps too surprising. Some other interesting stuff there as well. Climate change, a very small response there, and also smaller due diligence. I would have perhaps expected to see developing a better due diligence approach to be more popular. And then finally, just to think about the demographics of the survey. So dominated by food and agriculture, as you can see there, and in terms of the organization type, again dominated by corporates. So that gives you an idea of who we had on the survey and an idea of some of their responses. And no doubt I've missed loads of things that I should have highlighted, but that's for you, our audience, and for Diana and for Simon to help me pick out now. So Emily, let me turn to you. In particular, thinking around the comments on the recruitment and talent slide, what stood out for you here? What are the kind of key points, and how have they reflected what you're seeing in your own work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really interesting and important points to flag here. And just referencing the first slide, talking about shortage of talent, well, the next generation talent, I would go so far as to say there's also a bit of a talent shortage at the moment, and that's not just in supply chain, but across the board. And I think there's a lot of optimism that we can have around next generation sustainable supply chain talent, because there is a lot of interest, and I know education and training was touched upon in later slides as well. There's a lot of interest by upcoming generations, which is great. I think what we need to be a little bit careful around is kind of making the supply chain aspect known. I think it's maybe not the sexiest of areas. People think about going into environmental areas or sustainability, and it might be looking at cool EV engineering or whatever it is. And I think there are some really interesting and rewarding opportunities in sustainable supply chain. It's incredibly important. Businesses are looking at this increasingly as they start to tackle Scope 3 emissions, and as they look at responsible sourcing and human rights, those areas. So I do think that there is a shortage of talent, and that there's hope, but we need to kind of take the actions now to make sure these areas are known. And then the other point that I'll make around this is that I think sustainable supply chain is often lumped into just sustainability more broadly. So if you have someone who's a head of sustainability at a business, they'll be often responsible for the supply chain aspect, or there'll be someone a bit more junior looking after that. And that's a big ask. It's a big role. It's, again, hugely important for any business. And I think we don't always do ourselves a favor by pulling the supply chain into everything else. There needs to definitely be collaboration and consideration across all aspects, but it can be sort of just a piece of a bigger picture, which it is in some ways, but maybe we can do more to draw attention to it and the opportunities there for business. So that would be kind of an initial observation around that, and that raising awareness through education and training is key to bring these skills and interest into the space.
And in terms of the other results that the survey threw out, how do they align with the work you're seeing with your clients in terms of the way they're approaching not just the talent recruitment, but in terms of their overall business approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're the sort of want to see measurement and clarity around what success looks like is very much on par with what we're seeing. I do think businesses really want to get this right from an ethical perspective, and also for a number of businesses, this can kind of get into license to operate. So it is hugely important. And I think that there are risks in not having the right people doing this work, because you risk kind of getting the wrong information or kind of responding in the wrong way. And I think, I don't know if this is the time to go into this, but I think in terms of just overall talent, there is a huge demand on people who know this stuff. There's more people coming into it. But I think thinking a bit laterally about professionals in the space and which skills are transferable, can people move across different sectors that have already looked at sustainable supply chain? For example, fashion is probably a little bit ahead of a lot of industries. Can we bring people from that sector into another? Those are all kind of key considerations that are coming up. And I think it's kind of thinking about things in a creative way, and really selling that to the market. So it's a candidates market, and it probably has been for 2 or 3 years now. So I think businesses need to show their commitment to the space to attract that talent. There's, competitive salaries and packages are great, but candidates are really looking for, I guess, investment from a sort of, both heart and mind perspective. So that's another trend that we're seeing, and I think that's very much reflected in these results.
Sure. Well, let's come back to some of those skill transfer issues a little bit later, perhaps. I mean, we actually included the talent and recruitment questions. That's something that came up at our in-person events end of last year. A lot of people we were asking people about, what we should include in a survey, and that was something that a lot of people mentioned, that they just didn't feel that the talent was coming through, and that they were, struggling to find the right people. So that's why it was there. And interesting to hear your reflections on that. Thank you. Well, Simon, let me turn to you. Delighted to see you got the check shirt and zip jumper memo. Always all right, always smartly dressed. But thanks very much indeed for joining us. Can you reflect a little bit on what you see coming out of our survey results, the things that perhaps surprised you, things that perhaps were just what you expected to see? So give us some reflections on your thoughts on the survey.
Well, thank you for your comments on my sartorial elegance. I am wearing my COVID pajamas underneath, so hey, what? Yeah, I want to take the Coldplay approach. Go back to the beginning again, slide 1A. I come from an agricultural supply chain background, and I guess that colours. I think for me, there are 6 aspects, challenges, and we all know that the opportunities reside within them. It's about basically the resources that you operate on, the land or water. It's about your emissions. It's about how you treat people, so exploitation, about the integrity, often the food integrity. And of course, it's about the circularity of your business. The 6th one is, I think, the flare that illuminates the other issues that are faced in supply chains, and that is traceability. Without it, all of those other issues can exist, but you're not going to know whether they exist because you don't know where it comes from. And I guess that's my main point. to start with is that I don't think there's issues in the supply chain itself. It's not the chain that's the issue, it's the origin. And when you come down to look at the questions like, is there talent missing? Is it visible? Is there a gap in it? I think there is a gap in terms of people who can go down onto the ground and fix these problems. I mean, you look around at the various courses at the universities, I represent some of them, and there is no school of supply chain which doesn't really look at anything other than how we can use technology, how we can use imaging, artificial intelligence, blockchain to actually trace, which is fundamental, but not actually how you then fix the problems. And as long as there are going to be temperate countries that require tropical products, then there is going to be a chain, and that means going back down into those countries and looking at the issues. I think with all of this technology, it identifies where there is a problem. It doesn't identify how to address that problem. And so I think perhaps many of the companies on this webinar, they've done what I would call tactical sustainability. They have the policies, often an NDPE. They've got their must traceability systems. Some of them are absolutely U-Butte and Uber. They've got responsible sourcing guidelines, which gives you the do's and don'ts. They've often then narrowed their supply base as much as possible, cutting out the rogues, keeping in the saints, and of course, ongoing monitoring. But to me, that's a tactical thinking, and we need to have a shift. And in that shift into a more strategic way of approach, then I think companies need to actually look at this gap in terms of people that can do something on the ground. And for me, you know, it's about mitigation. It's about how you co-create solutions on the ground, the uplift that generates. And for many, I think it's in the too hard basket, or we put all our efforts into a handful of small farmers, which I'm an important part. I represent them as well in the supply chain, but they are not just the only players, and indeed unlikely to be needle changing in the work that you do. It will, however, be lifestyle and livelihood changing. So for me, we have too much of a reliance in our origin of our supply chain on basically NGOs, because there is no one else, because most companies do not have either ecologists or sociologists who are able to go and fix those problems, so we outsource it into someone else. And then when you look around about the case studies and the practical knowledge, there's not enough sharing of those in academic institutes, so that what you get is a very, very academic approach to things, which tends to be a little bit top heavy and very bottom line. So that would be my first comment to make. I've got loads of others, not least to get my own back on you with that comment about my dress.
Fair enough. I deserve it. I wanted to ask you, Simon, about I thought it was quite interesting juxtaposition in the results here. The fact that certification got a very low response, but what businesses wanted from working groups, industry bodies, is to be clear on measurement and success. Because surely, certainly in the past, you'd think, well, certification is your way to measure yourself and to measure success. Do you have any sense as to why that might have been put out?
I don't know. I was puzzled when I saw it. You're talking about question 3A, for those that have got it in front of them, where be clear on measurement and success. And there was, quite a large number, 40% of your survey. And to me, I thought that the role of standards was to put in place a mechanism, a way of verifying, a way of monitoring, verifying and reporting on what success defined through the standard looked like on the ground. I mean, I was involved in the RSPO, I've been involved in the Rainforest Alliance and quite a number of other standards, including the POIG, the Palm Oil Innovation Groups. And the idea was to actually strive for the top, a race to the top, not a pull up from the bottom. And so I was really surprised when I saw it in such small writing that you've actually got certification, because I don't know how you're going to measure success on the ground if you've not got some kind of monitoring and verification process in place. Global Reporting Index, the SPOT, the Zoological Society, great ranking system, by the way, doesn't actually provide solutions and doesn't give you a measure of how successful those solutions. And there was a while ago that everybody was on about impacts. You know, we have to have impacts. Our KPI have to have impact. And I think we've lost sight of that. So I was quite surprised when you looked at that. And then also when you looked at your question 5A, which was about EU regulations running the risk of encouraging individual business actions over collaborative approaches. If you look at that question in a slightly different way, people answered it as overwhelmingly, well, perhaps not overwhelmingly, of saying, no, we don't think that is the case. It is quite prescriptive, and you run the problem of having, if you like, government regulations or indeed stock exchanges being quite prescriptive on what you should be measuring, but not necessarily taking into account whether those measurements are indeed counting or whether what you're counting can indeed be measured.
Thanks very much. So as I said at the top of the hour, please do be putting your points, questions, anything you'd like to put at all into the Q&A box, and we will of course come to that. I also asked for the opportunity for anybody who wants to come in live to join us, and we did have someone just raised their hand. It was Gwyn Foster. So Gwyn, we'll make you live now, and please make your question.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes, so perhaps Gwyn, introduce yourself, please. Say who you are and who you represent, and then please make your comment.
I will do. Super. I want to pick up on traceability that Simon Lord has just been commenting on, and on standards. I specialize in traceability through the value chains. A lot of my focus at present is, or generally is, ground level, not only traceability control points all the way through, and the implications of technology such as blockchain and contracts and all the rest of it. But what we are seeing in the agricultural space is a change in the standards where it is moving more to an outcomes-based approach from a tick box audit approach. And that is going to, the reason for that obviously, and it comes back to saying, what is the data that we are looking at? The data comes from ground level. It's no longer appropriate to pick up at your first commercial point and ask for historic stuff. So standardized identity is key, but so is acknowledging that every farm, every community, every area is different and unique. And therefore, what is relevant to them might be different to a farm over the hill. That means that we need to evolve those skills at ground level, and our auditors need to change from a tick box right, wrong score story to an understanding and acceptance of what the standard is that has been set. And that is going to create huge jobs at ground level. The standardization is key. And at present, we've got standards all over, even within the various standards bodies. GS1, the global standard system, seems to be coming through strongly. Global Gap uses that. But the fact that we need to say my code, your code, my standard, your standard, my technology, your technology is going to be key. So thank you. I just wanted to add on to what Simon Lord said.
Thanks, Gwyn. And just tell us who you're with.
I operate as an independent. I've been involved in agricultural supply chains for a long time, and I'm now focusing on education programs to share my experience, because things are changing so fast. I don't pretend to be an expert. I will learn with the people on the ground. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Gwyn. Really appreciate it.
Can I ask Gwyn a question? She's on the line.
Sure. So yeah, okay. Sure. Why not?
Hi, Gwyn. I agree with everything you said. Hey, do you think if question 1A was asked whether there is a shortage the next generation of talent in auditors?
Oh, absolutely.
We would have
In
got the same answer.
auditors, in absolutely every aspect, because the education system generally is not catering for where we are now. So there's a whole plethora of learning, of opportunity. The auditors are still very strongly command and control, arrogant tick box, and that is going to have to change. It's a wonderful opportunity for youth. It's a wonderful opportunity for people in the field. And even if we come to measuring the data, we've got situations where youngsters in the field can get their drone pilot license. They don't have to control the data setup, the data stream, the data management. So we need to change our approach and see the opportunities tremendously. The other consideration there is understanding the control. So we come into the data integrity. That's a whole new set of jobs. Because with everything that is happening, there's so much rubbish going on that you have no idea whether you're dealing with a person or whether things are being manipulated and so on. So I see a lot of opportunity, and that's where my focus is.
I like you already.
This might be
I'd love to pick it up.
Thank you. No, that's great. Thank you so much for your intervention. So Simon, perhaps I can just turn to you then. I mean, this leads on from what we were talking about earlier. Do you see the need for thinking about, if you are going to use standards, if you are going to use that approach, it needs to be very much specific for an individual farm. You need to think about how, for it to be useful, you need to think about how it is reflected in the individual aspect. And Emily, I'll come to you in a sec about the specific recruitment issue.
Yeah, tailor making it for every individual, and they are individuals. I mean, behind every number, there's a narrative. Behind every dot on the map that's a small farmer, for example, or a small medium enterprise, they're actually a group of people, and they have wants and needs, and we don't always understand. I think if, for example, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil had got it right for smallholders, they would be beating a path to its door. But at the moment, they can't see that value in certification, and that's not the case. And I know they're looking at that and revising it through. But I think that there is a problem with the actual certification, and I think one of the root causes is being this auditor issue, and the inability to look at the particular circumstances, or indeed the flexibility of the standard to interpret what the spirit is in a way that is meaningful for a different location. Countries are different, provinces are different, sectors are very, very different, whether you're looking at in the Pacific, or in Africa, or in the ASEAN. And so we don't reflect that. And as a result, that's why, to go back to your first question a while ago, why has certification seemed to be losing ground? It's because I don't think it has kept pace with what it's needed to happen. And I used to have big arguments with the Scott Poynton of the Earthworm Foundation, or it was TFT in those days, when they would say we have to go beyond certification. And I guess my argument was always it's about certification and beyond. And the building block is certification. I think what we need to do is now go beyond that.
Thanks, Simon. Emily, I wonder if you wanted to comment on the specific point around recruiting the right people on the ground. I mean, Simon made this point earlier around, whilst all this focus on technology and everything else and solutions that are tech-based, there's been perhaps a lack or a lessening of the requirement of the need for recognizing the need for people on the ground with the right sort of talents. Auditors being an example that Gwyn mentioned just now.
Yeah, I mean, I can only agree. I think there's a sort of fundamental challenge in just that not being maybe such a recognized profession. And I think there is something, whether it's in supply chain schools or other disciplines, introducing these topics and kind of explaining what the opportunities are. And I was actually going to flag, it's interesting, we're working with a couple of clients at the moment that are tech businesses, and one of the things that they're looking at is how to kind of translate the language of farming, as it were, what's happening on the ground, to businesses. So they're looking for people who can kind of bridge that gap. And I think there definitely is a lack of people sort of on the ground looking at these areas, but up the sort of chain, and maybe a supply chain discussion isn't the best place to use that word, but I guess, you know, in terms of employees, that presents challenges as you go to kind of communicate with different bodies, and in terms of technology, there is a disconnect. So I think those are all things that need to be considered to make the softwares work, the technologies work, and at a ground level, I think those aren't necessarily the areas that people are training for, and they might not even know that those opportunities exist, and that makes it very challenging to hire for, and also very expensive as well. And I do wonder if there's, you know, the opportunity for businesses. I know, again, training and education was flagged a few times in the survey, but would there actually be benefit to businesses putting on courses or introducing those areas to kind of give opportunities to introduce those areas to up and coming students who are interested, or whoever it may be, or people within their business who might be able to translate their skills? There could be a huge amount of value in that for employers, but absolutely, I think on the ground is challenging, and it probably needs to be addressed.
Sure. Okay. Thanks very much, Emily. Simon, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just very quickly, a point. I've often wondered, I don't know whether the audience has got any comments or insights onto it, as to whether the role of supply chain procurement, not the quality aspects supply chain, but the environmental and social aspect, whether that role has actually been designed within companies or whether it's been assigned. And therefore, you know, there's not been a lot of thought put as to the type of quality or skill set needed for people to duck dive and go down through the, not duck dive, go deep dive down through the supply chain. So I'm just wondering what the audience thought about whether that is a general case, that it's not a designed role, it's an assigned role, and perhaps we don't have the skill set in-house to actually meet that. And therefore that would beg the question, well, where do you go then to get all this education and training? What's the best way? And can the industry come together? Is this a pre-competitive collaboration situation? Although perhaps that word's fallen out of favour.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Simon. Mary Johnson, I know you've raised your hand. I will turn to you in a second. I just wanted to bring in a point. This is relevant to what we're discussing right now. From Henk, he's contending with the point around the statement that you know, all problems are on the ground on origin, and rather suggesting that many producers want to change, but they can't afford to do so because of the way that current market logics rather squeeze the profit. So they know that there's a problem on the ground. I guess maybe the point there is really it's a realization that the resources are required on the ground, and that perhaps producers can solve the problems, but it's more a question of having the resources there to enable them to do so.
You want me to comment on that?
Sure, please.
Well, yes. It's not about whether the producers know there's a problem. It's whether or not where those problems exist. And in framing that answer to the question, he's absolutely right. There are problems on the ground, and in supply chains, it tends to be the origins of where the product comes from. Whether people are aware of it or not, or whether they choose to ignore it or not, I think that's a slightly different question and not brought out in this actual survey. But yeah, I would broadly agree with him. There's, in my experience, there is an acknowledgement and a will to change, but the barriers there are not the same barriers in this survey. There are other barriers, and one is the resource. Agriculturalists are not necessarily conservationists. Production managers, plantation managers, farm managers are not necessarily sociologists, and therefore, how do we equip them with the skills? And most companies, again, go to basically NGOs that do seem to have those skills available, and not all NGOs are as constructive as they could be. Of a more boycott attitude, but for those that are constructive, then there is a possibility of tapping into that skill set and resources. But wouldn't the industry do better actually have a cadre of people who could actually help and work with in a co-creative way, because producers are players in a supply chain, and the other players perhaps could have collective responsibility to actually try and put the resources in to assist them in fixing these problems. So I would say, yes, I totally agree with him, but would add that caveat.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon. Now, let me turn to Mary Johnson. We actually put out a note earlier in the week asking for anyone who wanted to ask a question, make a point live to let us know. Mary, thanks very much for getting in touch. Mary is the CEO of Regenerative Farms, and interestingly enough, I thought, looking at our opportunities question, I thought that regenerative agriculture may have come out a little bit higher in terms of the number of responses, because it's something that everybody is talking about. Anyway, Mary, let me turn to you. Thanks for joining us. Make your comments now, please.
Sure, thank you. So I really appreciate the data and the time it took to go into this, and the chance for this group to put their comments out. So I'm really interested in hearing from those who are on the line, seeing how so many are in the food and agriculture space. Really what Simon alluded to is sort of what are the solutions, what are the trends and solutions that companies in particular are working on in 2023. I think, you know, in question 2B and C, you see a bit of kind of what's going on in the big picture of things, as we're at this time in history where we haven't had to think and act in the same way, with the urgency of multiple calamities headed at companies all at the same time. And I think your earlier comment that the staff that are making these decisions and have so much responsibility aren't always coming from the trade, where sort of big picture ecological thinking and solutions was their training. And so this place that we're in history is unprecedented, and there needs to be, in my opinion, a lot more thinking done sort of across companies, from C-suite through procurement, through sustainability, and outside with these other collaborations on that solutioning process, because we're trying to tackle these problems that are coming at us now, that are beyond one company being able to just make a shift in what they're sourcing or reformulate their product. These big hits that are coming year after year to many of the industries, and now with also the transport and the pandemic related things. In my mind, many of these fall under climate change, and they're only going to get worse. And I think there's a lot of sort of ostriches with the head in the sand. Just that's too much for us to figure out. We're just going to kind of keep going with the sustainability checklists and just keep doing what we can do, because we don't know how to solve these things. But I'd love to hear if the audience has solutions that they're seeing that are really working, and people that they're collaborating with kind of across these boundaries of getting that lack of funding and investment happening, the sufficient knowledge filtering up from NGOs or those who do have it on the ground into companies, and kind of getting outside of the box. I know each company has their limitations on what they can do, and then that's sort of where they stop, and there's not necessarily those bridges and the funding in place to get to the next mile where the solutions are actually happening on the ground.
Mary, thanks very much indeed. And thank you very much for your points. Simon, do you want to comment on that?
I'm a big supporter of regenerative agriculture, because I think that's the only way that farming is going to become resilient. I always look at what I think are 6 aspects that really are the principles of regenerative or eco-agriculture, if you like. And that is climate change inversion, healthy soils, both quality and quantity, water stewardship, biodiversity and addressing the devastating loss. But it's also, I think, about livelihoods, and the livelihoods of people within an organization, the livelihoods of the farmers and the communities that surround those. And it's also about yields. And there are very few people who have skill set in each of those 6 areas inside of companies. And there's very few people who are the correct wizards to actually advise companies on those 6 aspects of where they go forward. So again, I think we have a bit of a talent gap there. So Emily, you've got a big job to do, because you've got to fill that one as well. Is that we don't have those skills. There are individuals who, you know, just shine out, knowledgeable and knowing what they're doing. But on the whole, the companies that really need to be doing this as part of a supply chain, as part of a realistic supply chain for the future, that skill set's not there. And we see a lot of big companies putting a lot of emphasis on regenerative agriculture and the way forward. I would like to see a lot of that more translated into the provision of resources. And it's not just money necessary, but the provision of resources on how to actually make it scalable. Because unless it is scalable, I think we're in for a very bleak future for my grandchildren and indeed their children.
Emily, do you want to comment on the kind of resource allocation? Are you seeing through your, in your clients, the kind of an appetite for addressing skill shortages along the lines of, that Simon is saying there? I mean, are you seeing this as something that is being recognised? Are you seeing a trend towards more resources going into the right sort of education?
In full transparency, not that often. I think there's and I think this is kind of dovetailing on what Simon's saying. There's sort of this immediate, and what Mary's saying, this is kind of immediate, like we need to do something, but we don't know how to do it. So they're hiring people, which is good and important, and they need to have, businesses need to have that in place, or other organizations. But I think the challenge is so big, and the call to action is so immediate and quick, that the focus is really on trying to get people to do what we need to do in the moment. And I think it is really challenging to look down the line and commit that resource to the training and education. So we do occasionally see that happening. It would be amazing to see it more often. And I think that will happen. I hope that will happen. But I think the world is still in a little bit of a shock by how great the challenge is. Just in the last couple of years, I think people's eyes have really been opened. And, we're probably preaching to the choir here with this audience who've known about these issues for a long time. But that doesn't mean that a lot of CEOs have been aware of it. So I wish I could say yes, but I think that might be a next step in what businesses are doing.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Emily. I wanted to bring in a question which looked at some of the risks. We obviously asked about the top 3 risks for organizations. And Marcelo made a very good point around biodiversity loss. It didn't appear. It certainly was a surprise that it did not appear as a result. Marcelo, I noticed that you did raise your hand. Would you like to come in now and make any further comments?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. So, Marcelo, why don't you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah.
Give us a bit of context where you are, where you're calling from.
Okay, thanks. Yes, my name is Marcelo. I work for GIZ, an initiative on sustainable agricultural supply chains. And yes, I had this question, whether the survey through the questions itself captured biodiversity loss, or if it then was reflected in the answers to the survey. Not only because last year and this year, biodiversity is quite high up in the international agenda, but also because, as we all know, consumption patterns also affect production elsewhere. So this biodiversity footprint debate is coming up more and more, and corporates are key in helping us solve and move towards perhaps a more diversified production system. So in that sense, the question was if and how biodiversity loss featured as a risk.
Well, yes, thank you, Marcelo. we didn't specifically try to capture any particular answer. We asked the question just simply, what are the risks? And we were surprised, in fact, when we came back and biodiversity wasn't mentioned. Certainly, it is a massive risk, obviously. And it was something that we were surprised weren't there, wasn't there. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about some of the risks. I mean, I mentioned in my brief summary earlier on that I'd expect to see climate change a little bit more to the fore. Simon, I know that you've been looking at the latest global risk survey from World Economic Foundation. What does that reflect, or how does the results from that compare with what we've got here?
Yeah, I was looking at it for, well, since the top 5, since about 2014. And what you see is biodiversity loss, climate change, climate action failure, environmental degradation, and extreme weather events. I know the definitions have slightly changed over the years, slowly but surely occupying the top positions. This year, the report comes out, it's the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. It comes out in 2022. I've just been looking at that, and there we have climate action failure as the biggest, biodiversity loss, extreme weather, and then loss of social cohesion, and I think impacts on livelihoods. Now, you can argue that the loss of social cohesion and on livelihoods in part is due to perhaps mitigation and adaptation necessary for change to climate, the warming of the planet. There will be other factors. There's certainly, when you look at the Endowment Trust, erosion of trust and a worry by people on basically their spending. And when you look at GWI's take on changes in spending habits over the internet and the use of the internet, there's a decline in terms of trusting the internet as a source of information. And indeed, there seems to be a crossover point where people are willing to sacrifice products that have a message to them. This was environmental only, not social, but have an environmental message to them. They're willing to sacrifice that in terms of the best bargain. And that perhaps is reflective in the countries that they looked at of inflation, and perhaps why economic climate appeared so much in heavy bold type in your surveys, because it was about the economic climate. So like the caller, like Marcelo, I'm surprised. Like you, I'm surprised, because I remember back in what, 2021, there's a cartoon that I've used many times, which shows the 4 big tsunamis in the world. COVID being the one in front foremost, because it was in front of everybody. Behind that, and you could still see it, that's why I like the cartoon, was the recession that was going to come afterwards, as we work out who the hell pays for our COVID actions. Didn't eat other things, such as in the UK, Brexit, lots of heavy goods drivers, and indeed the Ukrainian war and its impact on fuel. Behind that tsunami, the third was climate change, all visible, by the way, from the person on the beach. And behind that, the biggest of all is catastrophic biodiversity loss. So I was surprised that didn't feature. It should be a feature of regenerative agriculture. It was a feature of conservation many years ago, but that tended to be focusing on iconic species. I think now it's broader. Soil biodiversity, as well as above ground biodiversity, is equally important in people's thinking. And in fact, in some people's thinking, even more important. And yet, very few people are measuring it because you can't see it. You think you can, but you can't. And there's a consequence to that, is that it's not attracted a lot of attention, a lot of resources, and perhaps has slightly gone out of focus for a lot of people, certainly in this questionnaire.
Great. No, thank you, Simon. Very good points. Well made. I'd like to bring in, if I may, Pamela Goetsch. who also sent in some questions. I know that Pamela's joining from Australia. Time differences would be a bit challenging, but it's great to see that Pamela is on the call. So Pamela, if my colleagues could bring Pamela in now. Yes, you are, Pamela, joining us. Please make your comments, and if you have a question for our panel, please make it now.
Thank you so much for that. It's been fascinating listening to the discussion. Just checking that you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can. Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you. So, yes, I'm joining from Australia, and I guess my questions, having had a look at the slides and the outcome, I guess I was really interested. I'm going to focus on the notion that if you don't count it, it doesn't count. And I think Simon and Emily, this really goes to that theme that you've just been discussing about biodiversity and what we have. So, baselines, I think, are so important, but also so that we can measure progress or the reverse of that. So I guess I was thinking about the need for that in order to map change, and then how we actually articulate and define what we mean when we talk about sustainability, because I didn't actually see that defined anywhere. And that's something that's a huge debate in the regen ag space in Australia at the moment, those questions of definitions, because of course regen agriculture, as you would know, is a massive umbrella that has so many different kind of circus acts happening under that tent. So yes, that I'll leave it at that for my questions. Thanks so much, Ian, for including me.
No, thank you, Pamela. Thanks very much for joining us. I think it's a great point around definitions, and also this is something we've been thinking about at the Innovation Forum around, the challenges for people in supply chains having to deal with so many different types of definitions. Different companies ask for different things, different types of data sets, and bring it all together, and it's really, really challenging. I'll ask our panel to think about that. I'd like to bring in Christina Tharashini, who's also would like to join us. Christina?
Yeah, hi, Ian, Simon, and
Hi,
Emily.
Christina.
It's a very constructive discussion today. Okay, my question is, when we are talking about climate change, what exactly that we are looking into, and let's not talk about the increasing methane gases in our atmosphere. So are we looking into addressing this particular gas, or what are the approach that we're actually taking into addressing these increasing gas, especially this methane gas in our atmosphere? And my second question is, what are the skill set that is currently in demand for to find a solution to this problem?
Great, thank you very much indeed. Not sure if either of our panelists would want to comment particularly on greenhouse gas mitigation or methane, other than perhaps it's clearly something that needs to be addressed at scale. But I'm interested, perhaps, Emily, do you want to address the skill set question? Is this something you're seeing, are specifically looking for the skills that can deal with these issues?
I mean, definitely. And I think we've sort of alluded to this. Carbon and greenhouse gases more broadly have been probably at the forefront of concern for business. I mean, there are huge regulations coming in around that and in relation to global warming, et cetera. And so in terms of skill sets, I mean, it's really broad. Everything from reporting on those levels to engineers looking at technologies that can either reduce emissions or take carbon or methane out of the atmosphere. We've worked with companies that are looking at reducing cow flatulence, for example. So there's, I think, a huge range of roles in that area, whether you're a chemist, an engineer. I think the communication around this is increasingly important, and we're seeing a lot of businesses investing in that because the message is so important. And in a lot of instances, that's how you kind of bring people along and maybe gain investors and gain interest in what you're doing. So that's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I think the skill sets are really wide-ranging. And again, it is such a massive problem that it sort of takes all sorts to figure it out. So whether you're kind of looking at it from a scientific background, or I also really believe that if that's an area of interest for you, there are roles within those businesses that you can take on to address those issues. Does that answer at all?
No, it does indeed. I'm
Yeah.
fascinated. The thought of having a specific skill set pointing a CV saying mitigating cow flatulence. That's a kind of something we need to see more of on CVs for sure. Simon, I wonder if you could address the point around definitions that that Pamela raised. A really interesting one.
Yep.
You know, dealing with companies that are on the ground. Producing communities having to deal with so many different definitions around standards and everything else. I mean, it almost feels like it's the kind of the new audit fatigue. It's a thing that audit fatigue has developed into in many respects.
Yeah, well, just quickly, just touch on Christina's, because the oil palm industry that I've worked with most, methane is the most critical greenhouse gas. It's produced when the oil palm fruit is actually processed, crushed, its organic matter being released anaerobically. And you can be joining the methane pledge, which came out of the COP meetings. Most of the oil palm industry that are on a trajectory to net zero, to halve by 2030 and zero by 2050, are actually taking huge steps at capturing of this gas and using it to convert into electricity. So that's just a quick answer for Christine. Pamela's question, yeah, I think it was Wageningen University that analysed, I think, 291 research papers that mentioned regenerative agriculture. This was a couple of years ago that I think remember the data on, and they could find no common threads. They identified 4 themes, but no common principle when people were talking about regen ag. And those principles were, I covered 6, but I covered 4 of them. And that was climate change inversion, soils, management, if you like, water stewardship and biodiversity conservation and protection. When you looked at the companies, and I looked at the global companies working in my sector, then every single one was actually working on livelihood strategies at a small scale, albeit in some cases. And therefore, I think that livelihoods has to be a feature of any regen system. And then, because a lot of regen system is really trying to introduce circularity, high potential for circularity in agriculture, and then there has to be attention paid to yield and how we address the yield gap that's the WRI have for years been identifying population increases to 10 billion. The time isn't ready yet for a round table on regenerative agriculture, I don't think, in terms of a standard, because I don't think we're there yet. I think in terms of guidance, definitely, and what to agree and what would be the principles, I can go back to 2002. That was how the roundtable on sustainable palm oil started, was asking the question, what are the principles on which sustainable oil palm are based? And I think it would be very good for collaborative work on what is the principles, or what are the principles of regenerative agriculture, what then would be the criteria that you would put in place to think about those. But that would be a few steps before you actually then started saying, well, what would be the indicators of it? You say creating a, I'll modify my language, auditors. Yes, I think as your first comment said, we don't want tick and box, and this is what it will become if we're not.
Sure. Look, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw things to a close. We have run out of time. Many thanks to Simon and to Emily for joining us today, for your insights. Been fascinating conversation, and thank you very much to everyone else in the audience for all your questions, and particularly to those those of you who joined us live. I think that worked quite well. Something new for us at Innovation Forum, but I think that did work well. So thank you so much for joining us. We plan to make our surveys a more regular feature, so please do get in touch if you have any comments on the survey and any things you think we should include in the next one. If you'd like to partner with us on our surveys in the future, please also do get in touch. Do look out for more analysis, of course, at the Innovation Forum website as ever, and we will be in touch with the recording of the webinar shortly so that you can listen again and share with your colleagues. But that's all for now. Goodbye.